The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the first day of this 8-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in honor of the Buddha's own efforts to come to awakening. Well, I wouldn't say come to awakening, it's more like his efforts to understand how there can be so much suffering in the world. Is that all we do? We're born, painfully so. We get old, we get sick, we die, nothing more. And he found his answers. And the result is that even thousands of years later, we too can be relieved of these questions and suffering in general, because the practice leads us out of suffering through profound understanding of who and what we really are. Now, this being Rohatsu sesshin, we are traditionally sharing the Rohatsu exhortations of the great Zen master Hakuin, through whom all Rinzai lineages now in Japan and in the West, I believe, the possible exception of the Chinese lineage that goes through Shengyan, since he was descended from Xu Yun, a separate path, but nonetheless very effective as I understand it. And Hakuin resurrected Rinzai Zen at an era when it was moribund in Japan. He had searched all over the country for a teacher that had some depth, and was increasingly disappointed until one day, while he was attending a lecture series at another temple by another Zen master, he met a student of Dokyo Eitan Roshi, who had a tiny little cottage. That was his zendo. He was a rather acerbic type of human being, and so he did not attract very many students, but Hakuin was quite taken by the depth of understanding that this single monk that he meant. And they left the lecture meeting a tad early in hopes of avoiding anybody else going along with him, because apparently already Hakuin had attracted an entourage. And this monk led him to Dokyo Eitan, the old man of Shoju Hermitage, Shoju Rojin, as he's also known. And there, Shoju Rojin put Hakuin through the ringer. Hakuin had already had a Kensho experience that he was convinced that it was the greatest, deepest enlightenment experience anybody had had in decades, hundreds of years, actually. Well, it was a big head upon the top of his head, a real burden, that assumption of exclusiveness, big ego there. And Dokyo Eitan worked mightily to disabuse him of it, including at one point pushing him off the narrow little Engawa. There are, in traditional Japanese architecture, there are little, we would call them decks in English. In the case of Dokyo Eitan's hermitage, that one was only about maybe 16 inches wide, and it ran along at least one side of his little cottage. And he was standing there with Hakuin, and he just gave Hakuin a shove into the mud, and he kept calling him a rice bag. And yet Hakuin knew that this old man had a depth that he wanted to experience himself. And so he stuck it out. He was basically the only successor that Dokueitan had. The other monk would have been a successor, but he died young apparently. And no other monks were really interested in putting up with the kind of treatment that they would get under Dokueitan. But Hakuin was willing to do whatever was necessary to come to profound awakening. He had this devil chasing him basically from the time he was a child, when he was terrified of falling into hell. He was the usual little boy who did usual little boy stuff, including taking his slingshot and pot-shotting and killing crows. And then there was one remarkable experience he had at a little bow and arrow set. And of course, in those days, traditional houses in Japan, and still actually, the traditional houses in Japan, and most people don't live in those types of houses anymore. They have more modern houses that look more like what you'd find in Europe. But in those days, they were all traditional Japanese houses, and the walls were literally paper on a framework. And his older brother had saved up a bunch of money and bought a scroll that he was very enamored of. And one day, little Hakuin was shooting his bow and arrow inside the house, which was probably forbidden. And unfortunately, it went through one of those paper walls and right through the eye of the figure that was painted on his brother's scroll. It's very difficult to repair scrolls like that. And as you may know, his mother, who was a devout Buddhist, although not a Zen Buddhist, would take him to hear lectures and teachings of Buddhist monks and priests. And one in particular was a sort of a play that was taken off a story in which a priest in ancient times was accused of something or other and condemned to have a red-hot iron pot placed on his head. And this was depicted in the play, and the priest just stood there calmly as this so-called red-hot iron pot was placed on his head. And that gave young Hakuin the idea that if he would become a monk, he could escape the terrors of hell. And so he begged his parents for some years before they finally relented when he was 14 and allowed him to be ordained. And he did get ordained, and he did do training. His initial training was more about sutras, learning the sutras, and it wasn't until later that he encountered Zen training. And at one point, I think he was 19 years old, he heard the story of Ganto. Ganto was a Chinese master who was deeply realized at a relatively young age. And unfortunately, in his 50s, his early 50s, I think it was, he was beset upon by bandits who skewered him and killed him. And it is said that the scream he let out upon being run through with a sword was so loud that it was heard for 3 miles. And that sunk Hakuin's hopes for avoiding hell. How can someone as deeply realized as Ganto scream like that when he's being killed? He didn't understand what was really going on. And it took him a long time before he did finally. And when he did have yet another deeper awakening, he cried out, "Ganto is alive and well right here now." So consider that. In this era of COVID-19 pandemic, with so many people dying, and not just dying, but dying with great suffering. My doctor friends up in Denver at one point early on sent out a detailed message about ventilators and said, if you can avoid being on a ventilator at all cost, try to do so. It is a terrible experience. And I have a student in California who's been on ventilators multiple times because she has some very serious health issues, and they have actually caused her PTSD, post-traumatic stress. But that aside, let's take Hakuin's exhortation for the first evening of Rohatsu Sesshin. This is translated by Norman Waddell, who is a premier translator of Hakuin. He is quite gifted in his understanding of Hakuin's personality, and has translated a number of books. It needs to be said that it's a two-stage system to translate anything of Hakuin's, because Hakuin lived 300 and some years ago. And the language, in Japanese language, and he wrote in a vernacular, but that language has changed over the centuries. And so first, Hakuin's writing has to be translated by a Japanese professor who is an expert in the Japanese of that era. And he translates it into modern Japanese, and then Norman takes it and turns it into some amazing English that seems to quite accurately, as far as we can tell, reflect Hakuin's dynamic personality. So this is what he wrote the first night. Actually, I think somebody else wrote it down. He spoke it. The first night, the master said, to practice jhana, in other words, meditation, you should sit yourself on a thick cushion, loosen your robe and belt, and assume the full lotus posture. And here we are in traditional Japan, where people grew up sitting on the floor, and sitting in a full lotus was not that big a deal. And there were only two, even in the 1950s, when Mitra-roshi was training in Japan, there were only two leg positions that you could be in the Zendo, and one of those was full lotus, and the other is seiza. Nowadays at Sogenji, well, I don't know how it is exactly nowadays, but when I was training there, and all the years that I was going back and continuing my training at different times, it was one of the cross-legged positions. And it could be full lotus, half lotus, quarter lotus, what is known as Burmese style, or it could be seiza. And you could use a seiza bench. So it's considerably more comfortable than when Mitra-roshi, who fainted during that first sesshin he went to because of his pain trying to sit full lotus, was. So we can take this to mean really commit yourself to the practice. The posture is somewhat less important, although if you can get into full lotus, by all means do, because it's a very balanced, very secure, very centering position. But most Westerners have a very difficult time doing that, and it's not essential. I think here of Yaiko Iwasaki, who in the 1940s died of TB. And yet the last 3 weeks of her life, she had an increasingly deep awakening each day. And nobody who is dying of TB can sit there in full lotus. Her lungs were full of fluid. She was coughing up blood. And no doubt she was simply lying in her bed feverish. But her mind was able to focus. And this is the thing to remember. It is our mind that we work with. And it is our mind that we can work with. So to continue, after straightening up your spine and settling into a comfortable position, you should begin counting your breaths. The breathing exercise is foremost among all the countless samadhis. And here he's talking about the extended breath, the succumbing. When the cinnabar field, that is the tanden or the hara, below the navel fills to repletion with vital energy, start working on your koan. Cut life off at the roots. If you continue practicing like this over the months and years and are not remiss, your kensho is assured, as certain as reaching down and touching the earth with your feet. Strive hard, strive hard. So here we are at a time in the world unprecedented in modern life, filled with fear, anxiety, and many, many people are suffering from this fear and anxiety. And I'd like to share with you now some of the teaching of Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche, who as a child experienced severe anxiety. There is a way out. And on top of that, I want to share with you, I won't be reading from it, but this is an apt title. Your brain knows more than you think. Your brain knows more than you think, because thinking creates stories. Thinking is a picture of reality. It's not reality. And we are able to go very, very deep into this exploration of our mind beyond words, beyond stories. And that's where freedom is found. It's an exploration of our own mind. So here I'm going to share from a book called The Joy of Living, Unlocking the Secret and Science of Happiness by Yongey Mingyur Rinpoche. And it starts, well, it doesn't start. There are several pages, quite a few pages before this. It starts with a quote here on part 1 from Gampopa, who is highly regarded, one of the most highly regarded ancient Tibetan teachers. All sentient beings, including ourselves, already possess the primary cause for enlightenment. All sentient beings, including ourselves, already possess the primary cause for enlightenment. This is not something that most Americans would necessarily agree with, because somehow in our American culture, we think less of ourselves. We are filled with assumptions of not being able to do lots of stuff, not being good enough. And yet the potential is already built in before we're even born. So some of the words of Yongiming Rinpoche. The essence of Buddhist practice is not so much an effort at changing your thoughts or your behavior. Effort of Buddhist practice is not so much about changing your thoughts or your behavior. Your behavior so that you can become a better person. But in realizing that no matter what you may think about circumstances that define your life, you're already good, whole, and complete. It's about recognizing the inherent potential of your mind. In other words, Buddhism is not so much concerned with getting well as with recognizing that you're right here, right now, as whole, as good, as essentially well as you could ever begin to be. And that's perfect. It's not about you're about as good as you can manage. It's about truly you are perfect. And it's about opening to that innate perfection of recognizing it. And then it's so much easier to begin to live that perfection. He continues, Buddhism is not so much concerned with getting well as with recognizing that you are right here, right now, as whole, as good, as essentially well as you could ever be. You don't believe that, do you? Well, for a long time, neither did I. And this is a person who grew up in a long time Buddhist family. His father was a deeply realized, highly regarded teacher. All of his brothers are also, and he is as well now. Well, for a long time, neither did I. I would like to begin by making a confession, which may sound strange coming from someone regarded as a reincarnate Lama who's supposed to have done all sorts of wonderful things in previous lifetimes. From earliest childhood, I was haunted by feelings of fear and anxiety. From earliest childhood, I was haunted by feelings of fear and anxiety. My heart raced and I often broke out in a sweat whenever I was around people I didn't know. There wasn't any reason for the discomfort I experienced. I lived in a beautiful valley, surrounded by loving family and scores of monks, nuns, and others who were deeply engaged in learning how to awaken inner peace and happiness. Nevertheless, anxiety accompanied me like a shadow. I was probably about 6 years old when I first began to experience some relief. Inspired mostly by a child's curiosity, I began climbing into the hills around the valley where I grew up to explore the caves where generations of Buddhist practitioners had spent their lives in meditation. Sometimes I'd go into a cave and pretend to meditate. Of course, he was not trained yet in how to meditate. I just sit there mentally repeating Om Mani Padme Hum, a mantra, a repetition of a sacred combination of ancient syllables familiar to almost every Tibetan, Buddhist or not. Sometimes I'd sit for hours mentally reciting the mantra without understanding what I was doing. Nevertheless, I started to feel a sense of calm spreading over me. Yet even after 3 years of sitting in caves trying to figure out how to meditate, my anxiety increased until it became what would probably be diagnosed in the West as a full-blown panic disorder. For a while, I received some informal instructions from my grandfather, a great meditation master who preferred to keep his accomplishments quiet. But finally, I summoned the courage to ask my mother to approach my father, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche. with my request to study formally with him. My father agreed, and for the next 3 years, he instructed me in various methods of meditation. I didn't understand much at first. I tried to rest my mind on the way he taught, but my mind wouldn't rest. How many of us have had that experience? Although all of you listening to this teisho, at least at this moment, through Zoom during Rohatsu sesshin in 2020 at Mountain Gate, have already done a fair amount of zazen under your belt. So you've gone through this stage, most likely, of feeling like you've gotten worse, that suddenly it's almost like there's a spotlight shown on your mind and all the thoughts and so on and so forth. And he talks about, I actually found myself growing more distracted than before. All sorts of things annoyed me. Physical discomfort, background noises, conflicts with other people. Later, years later, I would come to realize I wasn't actually getting worse. I was simply becoming aware more of the constant stream of thoughts and sensations that I'd never recognized before. And the panic attacks continued. He finally did what each one of us is called upon to do in our practice. When he was 13 years old, I believe, he was admitted, especially admitted, because he was still considered rather young to go to such be a part of such a training. It's a 3-year, 3-month, 3-day retreats that are common in Tibetan Buddhism. And the times when he was called upon to meditate in the group were increasingly terrifying for him. And he would flee back to his room. And finally, he just got so disgusted that he went right into it. And here's what he says. I'd like to say that everything got better once I was safely settled among the other participants in the 3-year retreat at Sherabling. On the contrary, however, my first year in retreat was one of the worst of my life. All the symptoms of anxiety I'd ever experienced, physical tension, tightness in the throat, dizziness, and waves of panic that were especially intense during group practices, attacked in full force. In Western terms, I was having a nervous breakdown, and he's 13 years old. In hindsight, I can say that what I was actually going through was what I would like to call a nervous breakthrough. Completely cut off from the distractions of everyday life, I found myself in a position of having to directly confront my own mind. And that is the only way we can move through these periods of great anxiety and fear. And the amazing thing is that when we do it through deep presence, we find ourselves increasingly free. He continues, this is exactly how he did it. For 3 days, I stayed in my room meditating, using many of the techniques described later in this book. Gradually, I began to recognize how feeble and transitory the thoughts and emotions that had troubled me for years actually were, and how fixating on small problems had turned them into big ones. Just by sitting quietly and observing how rapidly and in many ways illogically my thoughts and emotions came and went, I began to recognize in a direct way that they weren't nearly as solid or real as they appeared to be. And once I began to let go of my belief in the story they seemed to tell, I began to see the author, quote unquote, behind them, the infinitely vast, infinitely open awareness that is the nature of mind itself. And he continues, any attempt to capture the direct experience of the nature of mind in words is impossible. The best that can be said is that the experience is immensely peaceful, immeasurably peaceful, and once stabilized through repeated experience, virtually unshakable. It's an experience of absolute well-being that radiates through all physical, emotional, and mental states, even those that might be ordinarily labeled as unpleasant. This sense of well-being, regardless of the fluctuations of outer and inner experiences, is one of the clearer ways to understand what Buddhists mean by happiness. And I was fortunate to have caught a glimpse of it during my 3 days of isolation. At the end of those 3 days, I left my room and rejoined the group practices. It took about 2 more weeks of concentrated practice to conquer the anxiety that had accompanied me throughout my childhood, and to realize through direct experience the truth of what I'd been taught. From that point on, I haven't experienced a single panic attack. The sense of peace, confidence, and well-being that resulted from the experience, even under conditions that might objectively be regarded as stressful, has never wavered. I take no personal credit for this transformation in my experience, because it was only come about through making the effort to apply directly the truth handed down to those who preceded me. And the truth is to open our arms and embrace whatever the mind state is. And this is becoming more and more recognized in modern psychology as well. To do the practice with focus and awareness. But when or if these extremely difficult mind states come up, panic attacks, great fears, whatever, and many of you have experienced these, then to explore the nature of the energy of these experiences, as if, for example, you were a news reporter who had landed on an unknown planet, and there was nothing, as I said, known about this planet, and you were there to find out what it was about. And so you had no preconceived ideas, and this is important as well. And to experience rather than think about what it is what will bring about true relief from suffering. It is a long process depending on how deeply you're caught in this suffering, but it is what works. And for anyone who's got actual PTSD, then body work is also important. As Bessel van der Kolk has said many times, the body keeps the score. And when we are exposed to a traumatic experience, we have certain bodily reactions that tend to freeze the energy of that, whatever came up around that experience, the terror, the thumping heart, the flow of cortisol in our brain, and so on and so forth. And it gets stuck, it gets caught. And so finding ways to engage our body in movement, and using the felt sense of the energy in our body. This is all part of freeing ourselves from being caught in many ways. And it also offers tools for going deeper in our Zen practice. particularly if we are dealing with unpleasant experiences. And there's nothing like some deep meditation to open the door to whatever might be stuck inside. And right now, as you all know, there's lots of anxiety flowing in lots of different directions. And for people who already were had some concerns before the COVID pandemic hit, it can exacerbate things as well. And to explore, to dare to walk in and explore will go a long way to helping free yourself from the anxiety. Many, many years ago, I was, for good reason, experienced terror. And that terror was something I had lived with and kind of kept under wraps mainly through dissociation for a good part of my life. And then at a certain point, I was doing therapy, and it took the lid off, and I couldn't stuff it anymore. And so then I would go through periods where the terror would come up, and I went into it. The metaphor that I would use was a sense of trying to skate across a lake where the ice was melting. And every time I would move my foot out a little further, the ice would crack, and there would be the terror. But one day, after about a year or so of working in this way, of just simply tuning in to feel the energy of that terror in my body, not the story of it. I mean, I know the story well. I know why it happened. There were many instances in my early life that brought it about. But I was carrying it far later than there were still any incidences for terror. The conditioning was there. And after about a year or so, I recognized suddenly there was no terror. I had reached all the way across the metaphorical semi-frozen lake, and terror had become so familiar in a curious way that it no longer had any bite. And it really, really has not raised its head since. When we walk into it to the degree we can, and this is the thing, we don't push it past a certain point. Otherwise, we will dissociate and lose the opportunity to free ourselves. But if we go in just far enough that it really is anxiety producing, and stay there, sort of feeling the icy winds until it is almost too much, but not quite, and then back out. And then another time when it comes up, same thing. And this works with all kinds of things, not just terror. We have moments where we're enraged, for example, perhaps. And if we walk into the feeling, the energy in our body that represents anger, because anger is simply energy. And it has actually, it has some benefits. It can get us out of trouble, it can get us into trouble too. But it provides energy to escape bad circumstances, if that's what's going on. And I can share with you something that some of you've already known. When I was in 7th grade and my brother was in 5th grade, we would walk home from school together. We lived in those days for many months. We lived in a very bad part of the United States, East Chicago. And so just walking down the streets at 3 o'clock in the afternoon was a dangerous thing to do. And one day, 3 big guys, they were probably high school level, and they had just somehow come upon a bicycle wheel, which I assume they had stolen. And they started hitting my brother over the head with it. And I saw red. It was a kind of interesting experience because I literally saw red. And there was no thought. I just started climbing up this guy, one of the guys, and pounding on him and scratching him. And these guys were quite a bit bigger than we were. And it so shocked the 3 of them that they quit and let us go. In that case, that anger, that rage that I felt, they were hurting my little brother, turned out to be actually quite a valuable thing to have happen. So sometimes anger gets a bad rap, but it's not always something to be ashamed of or to try to stuff or deny. Sometimes it has all kinds of positive potential. As I said, it gives us energy to move, hopefully in appropriate directions. So again, in this time when things are crazy making, really, and not only is there anxiety, but there's also people are getting COVID fatigue, it's called, where they're tired of being isolated. They're tired of being limited in what they can do, and the COVID pandemic is it's like a mysterious, invisible force. It's not like you can see what's happening as easily as in some other situations. And so there's a whole body of American people who are sure that it's a hoax. It's not. Hundreds of thousands of people have died all over the world, and many of them in the United States. So it's not a hoax, but it is insidious, and so it's not just the fear of getting sick ourselves, but there's also the frustration of limited access to other human beings if we choose to respect the restrictions. Try to go grocery shopping and you'll find empty shelves, not as much as were there in the initial beginning of the shutdown, but there are still things that you can't get necessarily, and it's a roving target. You go on Amazon.com to try to buy something that you bought a few weeks ago and you need again, and suddenly it's not available. And so these kinds of things were not things that we were accustomed to as Americans. And so they can become quite frustrating, and anger can come out of that. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And then, the whole thing with the need to communicate through the internet, and whether that is secure or not, and whether that is functioning at a level we need it to function in order to do what we want to do with it. Now that everybody and their brother is doing it, is using it, because the kids are all going to school online. Parents are working online. People are making orders for products that they need to have online. And people are communicating with other people just in general online. I quite a while ago, I got an email from a high school classmate of mine who every evening has a cocktail hour with his daughter, who is remote, and they're doing it over Zoom. And many people are doing that. There were a lot of cartoons about the Thanksgiving dinner with people sitting around computers or other sorts of screens to engage with each other. So there's a lot of change in life too, and for many people, change is scary or inconvenient or plain not wanted. And unfortunately, that is the one thing that is constant in life, is change. So we have a lot of material to work with, and that's fantastic, because we can more readily now, because of all these triggers, basically, all this situation, be more motivated to go deeper, to find out who we really are, and to become free in the midst of the whole situation. And, I like to share the story of the blind Frenchman who was in Buchenwald and who was dying, and who, as they carried him away to die, and he just tuned in to everything that was going on in his body. And instead of dying, he had a very deep awakening experience that stayed with him the rest of his life. Because even in that terror-ridden camp, where people were being killed arbitrarily in many different ways, and you never knew when it might be your turn, and there was crowding, and there was starvation, and all the rest, as humanity was struggling to survive, and in a place where there were people who were trying to make it as difficult as possible to survive for arbitrary reasons. And yet, in the middle of that hell realm, he had a profound awakening experience. Each of us has that potential. So let's get to it. We're only in the first day of sesshin, although we only have a few hours left, but go for it. Pull out all the stops. It's only a week and a day long. And if you die in the middle, then you very likely will have gotten some significant depth, such that your death will not have been in vain. Die while alive and be completely dead, then do what you will, all is good, wrote Shiro Wunan, who was Hakuin's grandfather in Zen. And as I said, he didn't mean become a zombie. He meant let go of your ideas of who you think you need to be, or who you think you are, or what you think you need to have. And you'll be amazed at how perfect you are and how everything is yours already. And with that, I thank you for listening. Stop now and recite the 4 vows.